I'm Jane Parry. I'm a lecturer in Organisational Behaviour and Human Resource Management at Southampton Business School and Director for the Centre of Research into Work and Organisations. I'm a sociologist of work, so my research interests are around how work is changing and the various kinds of disadvantages and inequalities within labour markets, within organisations, and how policymakers can respond to that. I'm a qualitative researcher, so I interview people to get my data. I talk to them about their experiences and their opinions and attitudes. After I did my PhD, I went into the Policy Studies Institute and I worked there for 6 years, which was a really exciting place to work at the time. We were working directly with government on evaluating labour market programmes. So that ranged from working with civil servants to giving ministers private briefings. But my interest in policy probably started before that. I did a politics degree and I then went to work for Peter Hain, who was then a local MP. He's now in the House of Lords and he was a big inspiration in my career. I'm working on 2 research projects at the moment. The first is a parliamentary academic fellowship, which I've just completed. That has been looking at how PhD policy fellowships have been running over the past 20 years in Westminster and more recently in the devolved legislatures. They're variously funded by UKRI and various learned societies. So that's been a really interesting experience seeing how research can be connected with policymakers, and I'm at the dissemination stage of that project at the moment. And then the second project is called Work After Lockdown. That's a larger team-based project, which is a partnership between Southampton Business School, the Institute for Employment Studies, and Half the Sky, which is a work design consultancy. We're looking at how under COVID-driven lockdown work is changing and how organisations are learning from that and the way they manage work is going to change in the future. So that's a really interesting project, but the parameters of which are changing as we're doing it. When we started the project, we kind of expected that working from home would be this self-contained experience. It would be about kind of managing almost a crisis situation. Maybe a couple of months it would last, but it's quickly becoming clear that it's going to be a much more long-lasting phenomenon. Organisations are learning a huge amount from it, and it's probably going to be an important part of their business model going forward as they kind of think about how they can use remote working and office-based working together as hybrid forms of working and all the new ways that they'll have to learn to manage that. When we were about 6 months into our research, 4 parliamentary inquiries came up at the same time, and it seemed like too good an opportunity not to get involved in some way, even though we hadn't yet published anything. So we got a lot of advice from Public Policy Southampton at this point. We developed written evidence for all of the inquiries. They all have to be different. They've all got different focus. So 3 of them were in Westminster, 2 in the House of Lords. One was a Treasury one and one was the Welsh Parliament or Senedd. So we submitted those 4 sets of written evidence and also gave oral evidence at the Welsh Parliament. So that was very exciting for me personally because I'm Welsh. My PhD was on the change in Welsh labour market, but also as in a kind of one of those nice coincidences, I got to give evidence with a professor whose work had been very influential on my own work. It was also a really interesting experience to do. I mean, it was remote, so they're recording it, they're broadcasting it live, and you can watch them live. So I was able to watch all the oral sessions and get a kind of idea of how this evidence was piecing together. And then they published the report earlier in the month. They quoted us quite a lot, and so that was just a really nice experience, which I'd recommend anyone got involved in, no matter how early you are on in your research, because you'll have something to say that will speak to that inquiry, but also it will give you ideas about how you need to kind of develop your research so that the live concerns are feeding into it. Our current research is very much about engaging with policy, both in terms of employers and in terms of practitioners. It was funded under the UKRI call for ideas to respond to COVID. So it's very much about feeding into the recovery process and sharing learning. So learning's about what is working well, how employers can learn from one another, and share what's worked well, what hasn't worked so well, and feeding into live issues like legislation around flexible work, what kind of inequalities are developing within workforces that are organised remotely, health and wellbeing interventions in the workplace and so on. So one of the ways in which we're doing this is by having webinars with employers. So we're sharing our findings at an early stage, but getting them to respond so we know what their concerns are, and then that can kind of feed into the next stage of the research. So what's happening is that employers are kind of responding in terms of feeding their learning around working from home into their business models, how that affects their HRM practice around things like virtual recruitment, online training and development, managing remote workers, but they're also thinking about the next stage, so how they need to be responding to the hybrid working, which is what's going to be coming. And what is unusual about this and quite exciting is that there's this huge vested interest in doing this learning, because organisations obviously want to survive, they want to thrive, become efficient, so they want to learn, and it enables us to have this kind of back and forth process, which is quite unusual at this stage in research. Public Policy Southampton have been immensely helpful to me over the years. I first got involved with them a few years ago when I was doing a project on flexible work, and they helped me to develop my findings into a briefing paper, but also run a policy roundtable at Portcullis House. So they gave me really good advice about how to connect with policymakers at this stage, and to have the kind of confidence to go and approach politicians to see if they wanted to sponsor a roundtable. And we got sponsorship from the Deputy Secretary of State for Department of Work and Pensions at the time. That was obviously in itself a good draw for the policy community. I mean, I don't think anyone said no, which is very unusual in a research project, obviously having the ear of the Shadow Minister and being in a place like Portcullis House. It was really valuable in terms of having this kind of informal discussion with policymakers, getting to know what their live interests were. And going forward, it was really useful because it enabled me then a couple of months later to put together an academic policy partnership with people who'd been involved in the roundtable, for which we were able to put forward a proposal for funding on age-friendly workplaces, which we achieved. When I put in for an application for my Parliamentary Academic Fellowship at the beginning of 2020, Public Policy Southampton were really helpful in giving me advice on that, and they even gave me a mock interview, which was really valuable because it not only kind of covered the topics you'd expect that you might need practice on in an interview, but they challenged me to think about what might be the motivation for funding this particular project. So I was able to kind of engage with policymakers' interests in a much more coherent way in the interview then. And then more recently, when we wanted to respond to these 4 inquiries, it was a very tough time frame. It was all before Christmas when you're trying to wind up teaching and research and so on. And Public Policy were absolutely amazing in giving me piece by piece advice on what's the committees are looking for in these inquiries, how to present it, how to differentiate your different submissions, and just kind of advice about, you mustn't submit something that's already been published and so on and so forth. So that was really invaluable in the process. We couldn't have done it in the time frame without them. I would advise getting in touch with Public Policy at an early stage in your research, whatever kind of level you are in your career. They're really approachable, and they really have a vision about how this might apply to a whole range of policy issues, and get you thinking about these issues and challenging you and giving you inspiration. I'd also encourage students to take advantage of some of their internship opportunities, both from someone who's evaluated some of these policy internships. They really have a huge effect on your career, your employability, but also one of my main research on this current project has done one of them, and you can really tell in how switched on she is around these issues. And even if you're not interested in a policy career, I think there's real value in doing one of these internships, because it teaches you about engagement with policy, which is becoming increasingly important in higher education with the impact agenda, but also in terms of writing proposals to a range of funders and having that kind of concise, impactful writing. Other suggestions about getting involved in policy. I've learnt myself over the past few months about the inquiry process and how amazing it is to have all these resources online now. I would, if there's an inquiry that looks like it might be of interest to you, go and read some of the submissions, because they publish the report, but they also publish all these submissions. There'll be all these stakeholders you won't have thought of, and you'll immediately be able to get a grasp very quickly on what the different issues and concerns are around the subject you're interested in. And finally, I would just say sign up to Public Policy Southampton's mailing list, because you'll receive all kinds of information on opportunities that you wouldn't have previously considered, and I think will fit into your research in a complementary way.